The Birth of Optima, Greenshore, by David Hammond. Chapter 4, Zuntra's Struggle, Part 2. The cameraman now emphasises his view on the old historian, who is now sat behind a table that holds the various books. Mr. Whitaker then proceeds to open a book that was sat on top of the pile. Running his eyes across its first page, he then begins to say, "Welcome to Zuntra and its struggle. Our glorious president, Theodore Hammick, was born from a Zuntran mother and a Zakatarian father. Both of Theodore's parents had met in the Zuntran capital of Greenshore. Theodore's father had been stationed in Greenshore by the Zakatarian military midway through the chronological timeline of the forced-upon communist era. The unwelcome ideology had been propped up by the Zakatarian elite as a way of controlling our nation's resources. Communism was forced upon the Zuntran people by the sheer might of the Zakatarians' capitalist empire, along with the helping hand of its forceful military. Should we have disobeyed, then we would have been slaughtered in our thousands within makeshift death camps on our very own soil." The reel now begins to slide with black and white photos of malnourished Zuntran citizens patiently queuing for loaves of bread. Whitaker proceeds, "For those of you watching the documentary who might be struggling to understand the difference between both capitalism and communism, I'll try my best at explaining. Capitalism and communism are two opposite political ideologies which are both democratically chosen to stabilise and steer a nation's economic growth positively using a democratic voting system. However, us Zuntrans had no choice at all. The monopolised nation of Zakataria is a capitalist system at heart that produces and sells its products freely across its own land. However, Zakataria are not exempt from their very own form of taxation, and according to my research, up to 20 to 40% of each individual's earnings goes directly back into the nation's infrastructure, which helps maintain the country as a whole." Mr. Whitaker takes a sip of water from his glass and then continues to say, "Communism, in the crudest way possible, is a political and economic system in which the major productive resources in a society, such as mines, factories and farms, are owned by the state. The nation's wealth is then divided among its citizens equally or according to individual needs. In turn, this meant that it was forbidden to profit from the fruits of your labour. Instead, people of Zuntra received food and clothing, etc., in the form of vouchers, which were then transferred for goods at local warehouses, obviously set up by our Zakatarian slave masters. Under the forced-upon Zakatarian manifesto, up to 90% of Zuntran resources were confiscated by Zakatarian corporations and either sold on or used within Zakataria to aid its worldwide tyrannical control. This had sent Zuntra instantly spiralling into poverty, to the extent that native folk died of hunger and disease in their hundreds of thousands. The projector screen now displays magnificent Zakatarian cargo ships transporting large quantities of goods that had been stolen from Zuntran stockpiles." Whitaker continues, 90% of Zuntran resources were logistically transported back to Zakataria on board large cargo ships, where it was later said to have been either distributed to Zakatarian cities or overseas military bases, which had expanded down to their dominating agenda. Their greedy communistic plan spread wide and far to nearly 70% of all other nations, creating a rippling wave of fear and chaos. However, the remaining 30% of nations, free from Zakatarian influence, had successfully rallied together in a frantic effort to put an end to the out-of-control tyrannical monster. They ultimately achieved this by forming their very own coalition called the Southern Alliance. At first, the alliance comprised of only two battle-hardened nations, Carrick and Tarunkia. Yet after much success at defending their territories, they gained another nation called Indiano, which had triumphantly expelled the Zakatarian communists from its lands. I begin to ponder to myself as the cameraman zooms in to statistical diagrams. The definition of communism had often left me scratching at my head when I was a child. However, as I gained more knowledge of its political influence, down to listening to the likes of Alex Bones and Alan Watt, I began to understand it a lot more. In a more simplified approach, from my understanding, we the Zuntrans were offered to either comply by being slaved under a foreign Zakatarian ideology, or systematically killed off if we were to disobey. The presenter then goes on to say, all three unionised nations created a formidable army that declared war on Zakataria. It was an enormous battle that has seen Zakataria and its allies in perpetual war ever since. The screen now shows old video footage of Karakian cannons catapulting the contents of their explosive shells towards a distant Zakatarian military fuel tanker. Whitaker continues, going back to Theodore Hammock's parents, it was from the Red Zone food bank that the Zakatarian soldier would find his wife to be. However, himself and his Zuntran wife were soon to understand how difficult married life could be when they both decided to move to Zakataria. Strong religious beliefs of the Zakatarians were totally controlling, as it was and still is forbidden to marry out of any Zakatarian belief system. On top of that was the disgust of Pavel, Theodore's father's racist parents, who knew their son would be tying the knot with a despised Zuntran slave. The Zakatarian authorities, along with Pavel's family, made the whole process of moving from Zuntra to Zakataria very difficult. Documented love letters clearly show their despair. Yet, amongst all the outrage of his protesting family, they eventually got married and settled into their new home. Pavel Hammock had used his earnings from serving in the Zakatarian armed forces as a deposit to purchase farmland. The Zakatarian capitalist system allowed for free enterprise of private property, possessions, etc. to any full-blooded Zakatarian. Seeing that Pavel Hammock had purchased the land in his own name by taking out a mortgage, it had given him lawful ownership of the property. A blurred bird's-eye view image of a fairly large farm now comes into view, which appears to have been taken from a great height. Acres upon acres of land surround the farm. There's a rather large thatched-roofed home connected to a number of adjacent barns. Whitaker proceeds. It was from there that they created a home and self-sustainably worked the farm. Producing and selling much of what they had grown, they had become self-efficient to the extent that they relied on absolutely no one. However, their lives were still pestered by the Zakatarian authorities, whom had begun to punish them even harder with higher taxation, all down to their disrespectful matrimony. Constant abuse of made-up policies that had been designed to obtain fines had major financial implications on both Pavel and Carol. Yet, against all torturous efforts of the Zakatarian system, their love remained intact After a long, drawn-out problematic pregnancy, Theodore was delivered at home. Even though his mother, Carol, was lawfully now a Zakatarian citizen, down to being married, she was not accepted locally as a full-blooded Zakatarian. According to historical accounts made by herself, she stated that she was not allowed to use any state sector service, which included public security, hospitals, doctors, etc. One event showed that Pavel Hamik had been arrested for grievous bodily harm. Carol was unfortunately caught up in an altercation with a racist neighbour who was behaving extremely malevolent towards her. The brutish thug had thrown an unknown chemical substance over her and the baby, which had unfortunately burned the baby's face. However, it could have been much worse if it wasn't for the quick reflex of Carol's shielding arm. Pavel responded with various blows to the head of the cowardly attacker, leaving the brute hospitalised with a fractured skull and a broken jaw. The projector screen now displays images of Pavel Hamik being carted away by Zakatarian police and then violently forced into a holding cell at the back of a police van. As Whitaker continues, Pavel was sentenced to 1 year imprisonment, even though he was merely defending his family and property. Alone at the farm was difficult for Carol, although against all odds she somehow got through it with the helping hand of some very close friends. That must have been Barrick's parents. Whitaker proceeds to say, when Pavel was finally released, he returned home to a mass of crippling debt that had sent them both spiralling into a black hole. Mr. Whitaker gathers paperwork from the table and continues. According to Carol, Pavel had sustained harsh beatings from fellow inmates, along with aggressive wardens. She stated that they preyed on him because he was married to a scum of a Zuntran, and that he had also borne a child with the despised enemy. Pictures of Theodore's parents sat inside a dull farmhouse now pop up on the screen. Their eyes show pure emotional suffering, along with early signs of malnutrition. Whitaker continues. The dark void of Pavel's time at the prison would soon be his demise. Pavel had begun to indulge in drugs. It's reported by Carol that Pavel had picked up the unpleasant habit, serving time in prison. Carol said that he had primarily used the drugs to help aid his suffering inside. She also stated that he would at times dabble in alcohol, to which combined with the drugs had turned him ultra-violent towards her. Pavel was numb with the pain of his financial losses and tried his best to battle his demons, but in the end succumbed to the dark lurking shadows. Theodore was only 5 years old when his father Pavel passed away to a drug overdose. The screen now shows Pavel's gravestone, which looks to have been vandalised with cruel racist remarks. Whitaker continues. Pavel's land was then confiscated and handed back to the creditors, who then finally evicted Carol and child from their squalor of a home in midwinter. For a short time after their eviction, they had been living on the handouts from loyal friends. However, their friends were soon to disappear, down to the hatred that was now being aimed at them. I can't believe the connection Barrick's parents had. It's amazing. It really does go to show how small the dome is, in terms of having someone's parents historically affiliated with such a pivotal part of Zuntran history. Whitaker proceeds. Having absolutely nothing, Carol decided to try to get herself and child back home to Zuntra. She was planning on the treacherous journey across the mainland, a single mother with a demanding child. Gathering her belongings, they left in the night. According to her, she had dressed herself and Theodore like two down and outs by purposely rubbing feces on their ragged clothing. Carol and Theodore apparently walked for eternity and took frequent respites across the barren, worn-torn landscape of Zakataria. so that she could feed herself and child. The journey was perilous, as the Southern Alliance was at war with Zakataria. She stated that she dodged battlefields along the way by hiding herself and child in ditches, whilst also evading aerial threats. They had been trekking for 4 whole days and eventually reached the snowy Zaka capital of Yule. Herself and Theodore arrived at its docks, exhausted. She recounts on how a kind-hearted Zakatarian trooper had helped her flee to Zuntra by covertly aiding her and Theodore on board an empty cargo ship. Fascinating, I said while continuing to sit with my mouth wide open. The pair spent 3 whole days at sea before passing out, both thirsty and starving, and in the desperate need of medical attention. They arrived in occupied Zuntra and were found by the cries of the hungry child. Straight away they were both admitted into a state-owned Zakatarian military hospital, to which they were both treated for dehydration and hypothermia within its squalid medical unit. Still images of Greenshore city slide through the screen, showing the true devastation of the Zakatarian Empire's brutal regime. While Whitaker continues, she eventually reached back to Greenshore with Theodore and managed to get housed at a temporary communist shelter. The capital was bleakly grey and depressingly dull, as you can see, while under severe communist control. The Zakatarian elite had infiltrated the Zuntran political system with bribery, meaning wealthy Zakatarian capitalistic banking families overlooked the economic values within the capital and smirked at the destruction of its previous Zuntran heritage. For well over a decade, Zuntran natives were taught to hate themselves. The Zakatarians achieved this by influencing Zuntra's curriculum, meaning schools, colleges and universities were all used as tools to embed self-hatred. To some extent, they had successfully reprogrammed the younger generation to be more subservient towards their Zakatarian masters, who had socially engineered them to become Zuna worshippers. Pictures of Zuntran children playing inside Zuna temples now display themselves on the creased projector screen. Standing at the altar of the temple is a priest, and just beside him a choir of Zuntran youths singing from hymn sheets. Whitaker continues to say, the new wave of politically correct zombie Zuntrans were like an army of personal informants for the enemy, causing many pro-nationals harm. Because of this, many Zuntran nationalists tried to avoid their own children and even nicknamed them snowflakes, down to the snowy weather of Zakataria and the fact that their children would almost melt when they heard anything negative said about their Zakatarian masters, along with their warped religion, said Mr. Whitaker, who switches the projector switch. The screen now shows video footage of Zakatarians flooding into Zuntra from large passenger liners. Some of the men appear to be gesturing with their hands, as if they want to slit the throats of the native Zuntrans. Whitaker continues, the importation of various religious sects was well underway, with a mass migration of aggressive Zakatarian subgroups. The religious Zakatarians had been fighting each other over their conflicting belief systems in their very own homeland. This was swept under the carpet by the snowflakes, who became ignorant to the fact of the sectarian violence. Zuntran snowflakes basically dropped to their knees when the Zakas arrived, and even welcomed them with open arms. Powerless to what was happening, the nationalists sat back and watched on as the belligerent Zakatarians raped and pillaged the brainwashed Zuntrans. One must understand that the primary goal here was to destabilise the nation and bring it down to its knees, in the guise of helping out the Zakatarian migrants. Zakatarians follow the strict religion of Zuna, Zuntra is an ancient religion that is followed by almost 90% of Zakatarians. Its extreme backward practices are primitive and cause more harm than good. It's said that the Zuntra faith requires its worshippers to accumulate wealth and then charitably donate it all into various temples in return for a place in heavenly bliss. The projector screen now displays the inside of a Zuntra temple, with its worshippers bowing down to a strange triangular monument that has an all-seeing eye at its very apex. There it is, the symbol of the pyramid. How weird. I must ask General Barrick about it next time we converse with each other. National Zuntran holidays were also now banned, along with the flying of Zuntran flags, as they were deemed too upsetting for our new so-called Holy Zakatarian ethnic guests, said Mr. Whitaker, as he displays video footage of Zakatarians burning Zuntran flags. Carol and baby, Theodore, lived in a refugee camp just on the fringe of the dangerous slums of the outer red zone. Many nationalists were displaced from Greenshore's central neighbouring zone by political trickery and then located within the poorest of suburbs. This was done on purpose to make way for the Zakatarians along with its belligerent subgroups. Whitaker continues, our new guests were prioritised within the more lavish areas of central Greenshore and its beautiful southern coast. The elitists strategically mapped out Greenshore by creating the coloured zones that we still have to this day, therefore creating jealous divisions. At one point it said that Carol and 9-year-old Theodore were sleeping rough on the streets of the red zone. Apparently the pair roamed the toxic suburb for shelter, always moving from one place to the next. That's my home. Damn, I missed the place, I said, watching on in awe. Whitaker continues. Carol Hammock had met a man by the name of Frank Sinclair. Mr. Sinclair was a former landowner who had lost his ownership down to the crippling propped-up legislative communist system. Frank Sinclair? Hang on, where have I heard that name before? That's right, the Frank Sinclair weapon factory. The factory where my mother had worked. Could this chap displayed on Mr. Whitaker's projector screen be the same guy? I said to myself. Mr. Whitaker continues. They both met whilst Frank was passing out provocative pro-Zuntran national leaflets. Stamped on the leaflets were articles of crimes against Zuntrans committed by the dominant foreign invaders, along with their fanatical religious sects. The projector screen now shows black and white recordings of riots taking place within Greenshore, as the presenter goes on to say. At first, the Zuntran revolution was insidious, although it gained great momentum for all the injustice inflicted on the people, having created an enormous, monstrous uprising that Frank Sinclair was at the epicentre of. The Zuntran army historically turned its guns on its Zakatarian superiors and massacred them in their thousands, all across the Zuntran Isles. Because of Zakataria's military commitments with the Southern Alliance, the pro-Zuntrans basically steamrolled over its drunk with arrogance masters with severe aggression. Military installations had been taken over by the Nationals, who then went into the inner city centre, causing absolute mayhem. Zuntrans started chipping away at the Zakatarian beast by extracting its troublesome ethnic subgroups. The immigrants who were considered safe could stay, while obviously being monitored. However, the hate-filled, insightful followers of Zuntra, along with its other schismatic sects, were dealt with by death. It was brutish, and the things that went on was absolutely barbaric. I don't condone them one bit. However, years and years of suffering at the hands of the Zakatarians had spawned a national resistance that was hell-bent on seeking revenge. Zakatarian families were gunned down on the cobblestone streets of Greenshore, which today is historically known as the Streets of Death. Images of dead Zakatarians are now shown on the projector screen. The dead bodies are strewn across the streets and appear to have been riddled with bullet holes. Whitaker proceeds. Zuntran soldiers were ordered to shoot disobedient Zakatarians on sight if they were to rebel against the uprising. Yet many Zuntran soldiers found that killing people so up close was too mentally traumatic, forcing the Zuntran uprising to think outside the box. They eventually used Zakatarians' very own gas chambers, which had been built by the Zakatarians to promote fear at the beginning of the communist era. These chambers were then used as a way of systematically killing troublesome Zakatarians more efficiently and less traumatically for the Zuntran troopers. Mr. Whitaker coughs into his hand and takes yet another sip of water to help clear his throat. He then swiftly follows on to say, bribed wealthy Zuntrans were also tried for treason and eventually hung from their necks, along with the barbaric conspirators. After the National Revolution, Zuntran lands were handed back to their rightful owners, and the rebuilding of Zuntra had begun. Our nation had also strategically allied themselves with the Southern Alliance. This joint effort of all four nations now applied a great deal of militarised pressure on the monstrous Zakatarian agenda. Now having the battlefield almost levelled out, people of Zuntra began to get on with their lives as the sense of normality prevailed. The screen now shows various coloured slides of Greenshore's famous landmarks, many of which have been proudly dressed in Zuntran national flags. Saluting soldiers are also on display within the images, marching past the elaborately designed buildings of central Greenshore. Mr. Whitaker changes the glorious images on the screen and displays a family photo that appears to have been taken outside a rather run-down registry office, as he continues to say. Frank Sinclair finally tied the knot and married Carol and accepted Theodore as his very own son. It was reported by many pupils at Theodore's school that he lacked social skills and apparently confidence. His confidence issues were thought to have been brought on by his scarred face that he had sustained in the acid attack as a baby. The left side scarring on his cheekbone and eye was like that of a large reddish birthmark. Theodore had become overly consciously aware of his disfigured face and would try his utmost best to disguise it. He apparently done this by talking to people sideways, only revealing his right side profile. He was known to be a very shy individual in his early years and would spend lots of time on his own, reading pro-Zuntran nationalistic books that were written just before and after the uprising. The projector screen now displays grainy images of Theodore when he was a young child. Stood beside him is his doting mother, who appears to be brushing his curly black hair. Whitaker continues. Theodore left school to join the National Army, where he trained and served as an infantry frontliner, alongside our Tarraconian and Carakian allies. However, he was unfortunately caught up in a bomb blast in Yule, the capital city of Zakataria, which unfortunately tore out his left eye. He returned home and adapted well into civilian life, yet the loss of his left eye, along with the added scarring across his face, had turned him into a recluse. However, as the time went by, Theodore eventually bucked up the courage and studied at the National Greenshore University with the financial help of his stepfather, Frank. It was from there where he studied the more in-depth subjects of history, physics, maths, biology, economics and art. Mr. Whitaker clicks the button of his projector machine displaying grainy black and white photos of Theodore wearing his famous eye patch, and continues. Becoming quite popular down to his eye patch and scarred left cheek, he had also become rather confident and overly keen in politics. Theodore had become a fanatical member of the Zuntra Defence League. The political party had been put together by a group of pro-national capitalists who had now put patriotic Zuntrans first. Frank Sinclair, being one of its main affiliates, had profited well down to his ambitious investments within the weapons industry, and many national corporations expanded because of the new party, who were commonly known in short as the ZDL. The grey-haired host clicks the switch once again, revealing the rippling Zuntran flag with the political symbol of the ZDL printed in its centre. Zuntra had now maintained all of its land resources and began to pump all of its gross domestic product into defence and innovation. The ZDL were in the driving seat with their long-time serving president, James Buckley. Thud! So it was President Buckley that gassed the rebellious Zakatarians. I bet lots of innocents got caught up in the wickedness of the gas chambers. However, as the old saying goes, the innocent will always suffer for the wicked. The presenter simultaneously sips his glass of water while flicking the switch to change the image on the projector screen again. Seated in the president's office is a black-haired gentleman who appears to be signing his autograph upon a stack of documents. Just behind him is two Zuntran flags that are both draped at a 60-degree angle. Whitaker continues. President Buckley had signed many trade deals with friendly neighbouring nations, creating an economic boost to our developing nation. Having violently cut ourselves away from the cancerous past of Zakatarian communist control, Zuntra had reached a new dawn, and its people began to flourish within its cities. Each of Greenshore's suburbs started their very own revitalised redevelopment programmes. However, unfortunately, Greenshore still maintained the coloured zones, as it had helped with order and control of its new national revolution. The image of President Buckley on the projector screen now morphs into a chirpy fellow who sits relaxed in the president's chair. Interesting stuff. So that's how Frank Sinclair was made president, I said to myself. Mr. Whitaker now looks past the shaky camera that is filming him and gestures to the cameraman behind it of a potential hazard. The presenter now chuckles at the cameraman, saying, "Sorry, ladies and gentlemen, it appears our cameraman has nearly set his hair alight, down to the hanging lamps above his head. One does apologise." Now, where was I? Oh, that's it. President Buckley served 5 terms in power until he was ousted and imprisoned for aligning himself with Zakatarian affiliates. He had foolishly allied himself with various corporations who were secretly backed by the crippled Zakatarian Empire. Seeing that former President Buckley had been removed from office and then sentenced to life in prison, this had given the then Vice President, Frank Sinclair, his chance to prove himself to the Zuntrans. Frank Sinclair automatically took office and got to work on the enormous task that had been left behind by the former president. Theodore was given an important position within the Frank Sinclair Arms Corporation, while Frank committed to his new presidential duties. Weapons were Theodore's calling, because his technical ability was almost like that of a special gift from God. He had proudly designed the SG-40 sniper rifle, along with the PKK pistol, while also working on the blueprints of both M5 and M19 firearms. Mr. Whitaker now pauses to give the observer time to watch slides of various models of weaponry that were skillfully created by Theodore Hammick. The slides also show the front of the weapons factory's main entrance. Damn, hang on. So it was the Sinclair Arms factory that my mother worked for, I said as I watched the screen that now displays side views of the Mini Z3 machine gun. Thud, old President Hammack sure knew his stuff when it came to designing weaponry. The presenter then goes on to say, Theodore also played a massive part in the concepts of both Z3 and Z4 schematics by reverse engineering the old Zakatarian weapon systems. Theodore's new weapon designs had greater firepower and weighed much less than the old counterparts that had remained under the fall of the early communist era. Theodore had also made a start in climbing the political ladder too, with the helpful hand of his stepfather, Frank Sinclair. He gained a lot of support from like-minded nationals and began running for president himself, as he believed that the opposing parties were a bigger threat to national security than an invading army, obviously with no offence to his pro-Zuntran stepfather taken. The reel now shows a picture of President Hammack with a clenched fist shouting down a microphone, obviously just before he was made president of Zuntra. Damn, that's an old photo. Just look at the passion in the man's eye. It's truly amazing to see a person show such patriotism. Whitaker continues. Theodore had stated in many public speeches of negative covert operations that were being orchestrated by the secret Zakatarian societies. According to Theodore, the previous political system, just before the revolution, was just like theatre in the sense that its political figures were merely reading from a script, tactically written out by the Zakatarians. He also said that capitalism and communism were both tools of the Zakatarian empire, and compared both ideologies as being like two blades on a pair of scissors that needed each other to be able to cut away at the rest of the world's resources. Theodore said that Zakatarian capitalists were working inside every propped-up communist nation and had slyly done it to extract higher levels of resources. He also stressed that we needed to emphasise our minds on the safety and preservation of Zuntra at all costs. Hammack also repeatedly warned about the dangerous effects of outside foreign influence within politics and said, quote, "If we don't hang together, we will most certainly hang apart by our necks." Another famous analogy of his was the fish tank analogy, in which he stated that patriotism was like an aquarium filter, because without it, the water becomes murky. Theodore's outlook on nationalism did at times infuriate folk who had read it as if he was being racist. However, he took racism very serious and constantly said that being patriotic wasn't about judging the colour of one's skin, but rather about what was in our hearts when it comes to the love of our homeland. I always thought it was our current President Zach Steele who said those fine philosophical words. President Steele must have hijacked them from President Hammack. Then again, I can't blame him. They really are splendid quotes, I said to myself. Whitaker continues to say, Theodore had also promised to change the whole structure of the system by dismantling it piece by piece, and thought up visionary plans to replace it with a more transparent system that would see Zuntra free from any outside influence, while honourably offering a voice for everyday hard-working folk. Frank Sinclair was desperately pushing for change in politics too, because he had seen the corruption up close and personal, especially the earlier Buckley scandal. The introduction of Theodore Hammack's very own political party within the precarious system wasn't as easy as many believe it to have been. Many assassination attempts took place on a daily basis. However, the tightened security procedures that had been implemented by his stepfather, along with the insightful services of the Zuntran Intelligence Agency, commonly known as the ZIA, prevented any loss of life. Video footage of furious Zakatarian nationalists marching in the streets of their capital city Yule now run on the screen. The upset protesters appear to be holding up cardboard cutout images of Theodore Hammick, which are then shown to be violently set on fire and then stamped on, as Whitaker continues to say. Theodore's patriotic views had infuriated the Zakatarians to the point that they were burning effigies of him in their very own capital of Ewell. The racist bigots also named him Mongrel Hammick on their placards, and even had the audacity to call him a racist. Hammick had now succeeded in entering into the Zuntran three-party political system and went head-to-head with two opponents. The competition consisted of a Tarraconian immigrant called Ragos Maita, and the other was a full-blooded Zuntran by the name of Zach Steeling, who was hoping to step into office after Frank Sinclair's departure. Mr. Whitaker now opens the table's drawer and slowly pulls out a folded poster. He unfolds the rather old-looking piece of paper and gestures the cameraman to move in closer. The poster itself looks weathered, to the point that it is frayed on all four corners. Upon my observations, I can now see a rippling Zuntran flag with the initials of Hammick's political party stitched into its left side. Two Zuntran troops stand proudly in the image while displaying their elaborate uniforms. The trooper to the left wears the familiar black and orange tiger trooper uniform, while the commanding officer to the right dons the elaborate field commander uniform. Bottom left of the poster reads, "Join the ZFP." Theodore's very own political party, known as the Zuntran Freedom Party, gained the support of two important owners of the ZIA by the names of Edward Zener and Alex Powell. Both men had slightly distanced themselves from the former President Buckley's ZDL down to the earlier scandals, although they remained close associates of Frank Sinclair. Having aligned themselves with Theodore's new party, Powell and Zener together started to battle against suspected infiltrating political puppets. Theodore's stern approach regarding transparency within politics, along with the importance of nationalism, won the hearts of his fellow patriots alike. The tough, no-nonsense stance also importantly won the hearts of Frank Sinclair's loyal friends, who all rallied behind the charismatic, soon-to-be leader. Frank literally piled enormous amounts of time and effort into the new and evolved party by offering Theodore many loyal contacts. Albert Stern, a pioneering developer of pharmaceuticals, also joined the ranks. Having been close associates of Sinclair, Zener and Powell, he too relished the opportunity to become part of the ZFP. Zakatarian soldiers had tortured and then murdered Albert Stern's wife, so it was only natural for him to align himself with a political party such as the ZFP. Wow, so Albert Stern was involved as well. Damn, that's news to me, I said as I look at the large portrait of the pioneering Albert Stern that's now being displayed onto the projector screen. What a great inventor. May he rest in peace. Whitaker continues. People flocked to the polling stations in their thousands, and in the summer, Theodore Hammick eventually won the political elections, hands down, and was immediately put at the top of the Zuntran throne. The screen now shows thousands upon thousands of hardline nationalists queuing outside the polling stations. 6 months after Theodore got his presidential position, Carol Sinclair, his much-loved mother, unfortunately died of heart complications. Speculations of foul play did arise, yet with no form of actual evidence. They were soon to dissipate. Straight after his mother's death, he got to work on the investigative work regarding the enemy within, with the helping hand of both Zener and Powell's ZIA. Zener and Powell had made extraordinary breakthroughs and had shone a light on some very shady individuals that were found to be threatening the pathway for a true transparent system. It's now a well-known fact that the death of Theodore's mother had considerably changed him. It said that he became slightly withdrawn from the whole situation of losing her. On top of that was the enormous task of rooting out the corrupt cells within the Zuntran political system. An image of the projector screen now shows President Hammock kneeling down at his mother's grave while holding a single red rose tightly in his grasp. Countless numbers of black umbrellas surround his position, along with his observant security staff. Pictured in the background of the photo is the President's very own personal helicopter, with his mother's name printed on the side of its cockpit. Whitaker continues. After 2 years of being in the presidential seat, Hammock, along with his circle of loyal affiliates, had managed to root out many Zakatarian spies. The infiltrators were trialled in Zuntran Supreme Courts, and from there either imprisoned or sentenced to death. President Hammock left no stone unturned as he pressed on with his main aim, which was outright nationalism, said Mr. Whitaker, slamming his clenched fist down hard onto the table. The earlier Zakatarian candidate, Mr. Ragus Miter, was found to have been primed by the Zakatarian elite. It's now known that he was sent inside Zuntra to help infiltrate its weak political system. Whitaker proceeds. According to the ZIA, they confirmed Mr. Miter as being a plotted political puppet who was going to jeopardise the defensive positions of the Zuntran military. Evidence showed that Mr. Miter was also looking to sign peace treaties along with trade deals with the Zakatarians. This would have undoubtedly opened Zuntra up to spontaneous Zakatarian attacks if he had won, because we would have no longer been aligned to the Southern Alliance. The projector screen now shows video footage of the bearded Mr. Miter being swiftly escorted away by 6 Tiger troopers. It looks as if he had taken a severe beating too, because his face appears to show heavy bruising. Whitaker continues. The 2 owners of the ZIA, Mr. Powell and Mr. Zena, had monitored Mr. Miter's every Zmail and Zeli communications ever since the elections, and had compiled in-depth recordings of his deceit. Ragus Miter was later sentenced to life imprisonment, to which he still serves to this day. Video footage of Greenshore city now comes into view, followed by the surrounding half-built walls of President Hammock. Just behind the walls are the building works that now acts as platforms for our star weapon systems that are still used to this day. Whitaker proceeds. On Theodore's first time of presidency, he started on the foundation of the defensive city walls that circle around the inner part of Greenshore Circular Park. The walls only took 2 years to accomplish, which at the time was a world record regarding structural engineering. Shortly after the development of the city's walls, he installed the platforms for our surface-to-air weapon defence systems, said the presenter. He then started with the development of the surrounding zones. The outer suburban zones' defensive Z3s were replaced by the more highly advanced long-range Z4 defensive installations that he himself had designed. Zuntra's infrastructure as a whole was now well underway, with even more major redevelopments for our neighbouring cities, brought in by their elected mayors, said Mr. Whitaker as he displays the map of Zuntra on the screen, along with its highlighted cities that spread around the whole of the Zuntran Isles. He also took a great gamble and positioned Zach Steeling, the losing contender of the opposing party, as his vice president, because he sees something special in the man. And I must say, Zach Steeling is loyal as they come, as we have already witnessed. Whitaker continues. Warring Zakataria was still economically stretched from its many battles that were still ongoing with the Southern Alliance. The Southern Alliance had successfully continued to keep the Zakatarians' ideological communist slavery away from their lands, which had lucky enough brought President Hammock some precious time. "Ah, fud," I exclaimed as I watched still photographs of the mound silos. "It's the fudding pits." Whitaker continues to say, "We had successfully rebuilt our home, but that wasn't all. President Hammack had also destroyed any remnants of the old system, disposing of its fluoridated water into the Zuntra Ocean. Cunning Zakatarians during the communist era had built the specialised storage silos around the central city, which at the time contained large quantities of fluoride." I remember learning about this on the Alex Bone show. Or was it Alan Watt? Whitaker continues, "Pharmaceutical expert Albert Stern reported that the Zakatarians had purposely used fluoride to help keep the eastern suburb zones dumbed down. It was believed at the time by the indoctrinated Zuntrans to have been diluted into the water to help them maintain healthy teeth. Yet little did they know it was actually being used as a way of making them stupid, while slowly killing them off too." The historian now pauses to take yet another swig of water, and then begins to prepare himself by loosening his red tie. Mr. Whitaker drops his head and then slowly aligns it to the camera and says, "Then the devastating news had surfaced. It rippled through Zuntra like an earthquake and hit every patriot's heart like a hurtling bullet. Theodore Hammack had been assassinated whilst touring the completion of the Z3 instalments at the surrounding North Wall. He was historically struck by a rogue shooter who let loose with a SG-40 sniper's rifle while the president was conversing to his pro-national supporters. Because of his charismatic persona, President Hammack would at times stop his convoy to meet up with groups of pro-Zuntran nationalists. Furthermore, he would at times overstay these greetings, which would apply tremendous amounts of strain on his security staff." Crud! So his life was ended by the same thing he created, I crazily said to myself. The formidable SG-40 sniper rifle. Floral tributes now come into view along the inner section of the inside city wall. Weeping Zuntrans stand defiant with ZFP flags draped over their shoulders, as Whitaker goes on to say. A single shot had ripped straight through the president's right eye, totally tearing off half of his skull in the process. It said that the president was still breathing when the paramedics arrived. However, he unfortunately died from his injuries on the way to New Haven Hospital. The shooter unfortunately got away, and to this day nobody knows who the assassin was. Investigative work carried out by the ZIA suggested that the shooter was either a Tarokian or Karakian, down to the Southern Alliance sniper mask that was accidentally left behind at the scene of where the sniper took his devastating shot. The nation as a whole had gone into a deep state of mourning, causing many of the president's fanatical supporters to seek revenge on the remaining Zakatarians. Gory photos of dead law-abiding Zakatarians now come into view, which show men, women and children that had been targeted in reprisals. Whitaker continues, after an outcry of peace from Vice President Zach Steeling, Zuntra eventually returned to normality. Theodore's state funeral took place, said the presenter as he sheds a tear. I do hope you have enjoyed the documented video version of my work, but please purchase my book version and pass it on to as many patriots as possible. Let's not forget those sacrifices made by our courageous president, Mr. Theodore Hammack. The reel now ends with elaborate Zuntran national orchestrated music that plays for some time after. Grainy images of the late President Hammack hugging his mother flick past at a slow, consistent rate. A painting of the president majestically sitting in front of the rippled Zuntran flag now displays on the screen. The flag itself gracefully displays the political emblem of the ZFP. I sit on the now warm sofa, totally amazed from what I have learned, as I intensely watch the credits scroll down the projector screen. What a true gentleman. Must admit, I'm beginning to shed a tear for his heroism myself. The passionate views of the man regarding national pride was something quite extraordinary. The room has made me feel drowsy from the dim light that reflects from the projector screen. The light travels around the reflective steel panelled walls, forcing me to battle to keep my eyes open. An eerie feeling of a presence erupts inside the room, sending an extremely cold shiver down my spine. It almost feels as if someone or something is standing behind me as I lay paralysed on the sofa. I try to move my body, but I'm unable to do so. The manifestation of a spinning, sparkling orb catches my attention. A slightly lighter coloured orb materialises too, right before my very eyes. The larger of the two orbs is 1 inch in size at waist height, while the other floats at head height. What the fud? I'm now totally crudding myself as I watch the two orbs spin and expand, forcing me to immediately close my eyes in outright fear. What is this? Could I be dreaming? I begin to get panicked and slowly open one eye. It appears the pair of mysterious orbs have now connected and materialised into a signal white flickering body of light with growing legs and arms. Oh my God! I can now hear the eerie sound of white noise, slowly getting louder and louder, followed by a high-pitched screeching sound. I move my eyes rapidly around the room, desperately trying my best to figure out where it's coming from. A tall, glitchy apparition of a pixelated lady appears right before my very eyes and seems to be decked out in an all-in-one, heavenly white, tight-fitted jumpsuit. The manifestation looks strikingly like my mother. She looks older and happier. It seems that both of the mysterious orbs have somehow created a single glitching ghost-like figure of my mum. Leaning forward from her position, she begins to spookily move towards me. She then gently lifts her right hand and places her index finger up against her lips. The illusion appears to be gesturing to me with her mouth, and it looks like she's telling me to be quiet. What the heck? Why can't I move? The strange manifestation now turns her left hand, revealing a heavily glowing palm. She now motions a soothing, everything will be okay, with her right hand, and even motions it with her lips. Having failed to snap out of my sleep paralysis, I go with the flow and notice that my breathing has now become much calmer. I try to reach out my right hand to see if I can touch her glitching face. However, I fail abysmally and watch on as she attempts to press her lips against my forehead that is now dripping pearls of sweat. With a single blink of an eye, she vanishes into thin air. "Mum," I said as I regained control of my body by wriggling my fingers and toes. I nervously stand up with a tingling sensation deep within my skull. Totally confused, I move to the right and stretch out my arm to where the ghostly figure had stood. Should anyone walk in on me now, I would probably be sectioned under the Mental Health Act. Having waved my hands around in the air like a lunatic, I then throw myself back into the inflated red leather Chesterfield sofa. My body hits the now deflated cushions down to the forceful impact of my body. What the fud was all that about? I crazily said to myself. To be continued.